In the grim galaxy where death and blood reign, it is impossible to imagine someone who could be a paragon of perfection. Except, of course, the Emperor of mankind, perfect in his divine flawlessness. But can the same be said about his finest creations? Today, I shall tell you the full story of Fulgrim, the Emperor's son, who traded perfection for its illusion. It is known that during the mysterious event that scattered the gestation capsules of the Primarchs across the galaxy, Fulgrim was designated to land on Chogoris. However, during the transportation, the winds of the warp changed the course and threw onto this planet Jagatai Khan, who had previously been intended for Chemos. Whether there was any intent in the actions of the destructive forces or they swapped the Primarchs for amusement will forever remain a mystery. Nonetheless, the ambiguous resemblance of the brothers would prove to be one of the reasons for their mutual animosity in the future. Contrary to the original plan, the capsule with Fulgrim descended onto the surface of Chemos. Researchers familiar with the conditions of planets like Nocturne, Inwit, or Medusa are well aware that harsh circumstances can breed individuals of iron character. On the brink of survival, society's members learn about support and mutual aid, collective responsibility and discipline, or they shift to barbaric rule where only the strongest are deemed worthy of life. From the beginning of the 30th millennium, Chemos belonged to the latter type, with the difference being that existence on the planet could hardly be called a full life. The main exacerbating factor was the harsh climate, which meant that even in the best years, the world could not achieve a level of full self-sufficiency. Rich in useful resources, Chemos in the early years of colonization engaged in trade with other civilizations, exchanging mined resources for food and water. However, it soon became clear that selling minerals without having its own production could lead to an economic collapse. The age of strife isolated the planets from one another, and the multi-billion population of Chemos faced the threat of global famine. Mass extinction led to a decrease in population, wars for the remaining resources, and the establishment of inhumane laws on compulsory euthanasia for orphans, the sick, and the elderly. By the time of Fulgrim's arrival, civilization had degraded to several independent mining cities where people did nothing but grueling work for a fragment of processed waste turned into food. On Chemos, there were no terrible earthquakes that changed the planet's landscape as on Fenris, but instead there were deadly tornadoes with metallic particles, which presumably developed due to a cycle of technogenic disasters. Therefore, the population hardly ever went to the surface, and people often reached adulthood without ever seeing the sky. However, a denizen of Terra would say that the inhabitants of Chemos lost a bit, as the dim star of Fulgrim's homeland could not pierce through the dense clouds, and the world, both day and night, was immersed in the same gloom. Therefore, a bright falling star in the sky became an event that every city noticed. Realizing that the mysterious object could carry a cache of precious resources, the rulers of the settlements tried as soon as possible to send their expedition to the crash site. The first to reach the capsules, with the Primarch, were three workers, Sullux, Corin, and Tulea. Striving to get to the object as soon as possible, in hopes of securing a slightly larger share of supplies from their masters in case of success, the travellers bravely risked their lives and sheltered together from the metallic tempest. As expected, common hardships united people, but insurmountable contradictions flared up as soon as the hatch of the capsule was opened. Corin and Tulea were charmed by the infant Primarch, while Sullux considered that the Primarch should be killed according to the existing laws of the planet. Neither the fact that a unique source of clean water miraculously appeared at the crash site, which was unique for Chemos, nor the obvious need to learn the reasons for the child's fall to the planet stopped the man in his pursuit. Unwilling to hand the boy over to a murderer, Tulea shot Sullux. It is unknown whether there was a punishment for attacking a fellow expedition member on Chemos at that time, but the woman did not suffer in any way for her action. It is quite possible that Sullux's death could be attributed to one of the many dangers of the journey. Corin and Tulea brought the infant to their city, Calac, presenting him as their own son. Thanks to their care, the little Primarch was able to survive the brief period of helplessness and turn into an exceptionally smart child. The name Fulgrim was given to him from a mythical deity of Chemos, most likely borrowing the legend from ancient earth tales about Nuada Silverhand. On the impoverished planet where water was more valuable than any other resource, tales were told of an ancient hero who brought people not only a clean source but also subsequent rejuvenation and healing. The adoptive parents saw in Fulgrim a hope and were ready to sacrifice their meager rations for the well-being of their son. Later, the Primarch bitterly said that Corin and Tulea did what they could. Simple workers, they instilled in Fulgrim humility, industriousness and appreciation for simple joys, but his nature could not exist within the confines suitable for most. By the day the Primarch could start working himself, Chemos was in acute shortage of resources and qualified workers. Therefore, the knowledge that Fulgrim inherited thanks to the genius of the Emperor helped him rapidly climb the career ladder. Beginning as a mere miner, the Primarch impeccably displayed himself in the position of an engineer and eventually reached the highest echelon of the city's administrators of Calac. At this stage, food and material goods of a different quality were unveiled. Fulgrim hoped that through his talents and diligence he could finally provide his parents with a life where they wouldn't have to toil to exhaustion daily. However, unfortunately, the Primarch was not destined to do so. Corin and Tulea died on the eve of their son's appointment to a position that would have guaranteed them all a life of ease. Throughout his life, Fulgrim sometimes felt guilty for not being able to repay his parents for their effort and love. Their marble busts were located on the Primarch's desk even in the final period of the Great Crusade. Sometimes the warrior spoke to them, thanking or apologizing. However, he refused to admit that he loved his parents, describing his feelings towards them as pity. Seeing that the senior administrators of his mining city lived much better than the majority of the workers, and even had significant excesses, Fulgrim realized that with skillful redistribution of goods and competent leadership, he could change the situation threatening the population of Chemos with ultimate extinction. However, the Primarch lacked both the means and supporters with whom he could carry out a successful coup. Therefore, to avoid unnecessary bloodshed, Fulgrim decided to venture into the abandoned lands and establish his own colony there. The Primarch called on all those willing to join him, thus forming a team of the bravest and most desperate, as none of such ventures in the past had ever been successful. The expedition could perish on the way from another tornado, radiation exposure, or simple starvation. The lack of a clearly defined destination also detracted from Fulgrim's idea of supporters, but those who joined him knew for sure, if they stayed, their life would never get better. The Primarch's venture turned out to be successful. The expedition reached one of the abandoned factories and erected a new settlement there. Thanks to reinforced walls, people no longer needed to leave the surface, which allowed for reduced intervals between sorties and the discovery of more resources created before the catastrophe. The society founded by Fulgrim began to rapidly develop within a few years, surpassing the living standards of all existing city-states. During this period, the Primarch, with a group of loyal warriors, conducted forays into neighboring settlements, studying other cultures and inviting them to join. As a rule, people were glad to become part of the state being built by Fulgrim. However, sometimes such meetings ended in bloodshed. Not all surviving Chemosians managed to maintain a human form. Societies of cannibals conducting raids on less aggressive communities were not uncommon. Monsters arising from high radiation or other unknown factors were also encountered. Fulgrim slew one such beast in the depths of an abandoned drilling station, becoming the sole survivor of the doomed expedition. However, most cities not only willingly accepted the invitation of the Primarch, but they also sent their own diplomats to Fulgrim. The rumor that life under the rule of the ascending ruler was much better than before quickly spread across Chemos, attracting more and more people to the new state. The heads of many administrative dynasties offered their own daughters in marriage to the Primarch, and some of these proposals were accepted by him, guided by political motives. According to sources on Chemos, Fulgrim had married several times, and to the first of his wives, he possibly even felt tender feelings. However, love is too imperfect a phenomenon for the son of the Emperor, created for other purposes. Even then, when he had not yet suspected the existence of his creator and his designs, Fulgrim knew. Love is an impermissible weakness for one who bears the responsibility for preserving billions of people. The Primarch's view on this matter was not unfounded. In conquering Chemos, he had realized cities that obeyed out of fear were much less reliable than those who came on their own out of admiration for Fulgrim himself. Warriors who fought out of love for him did so with much more zeal than those motivated by duty. According to the Primarch, love in human hearts is stronger than fear, since fear can be defeated, but love never. Accordingly, such a strong feeling in the souls of citizens was worth harnessing for one's own purposes, but to allow oneself to experience it was tantamount to jeopardizing the security of the realm. In the process of unifying Chemos, the Primarch had to go against his feelings more than once. One such episode was the extermination of the Sulfur, a nomadic tribe distinguished by their excellent swordsmanship. This people believed that a true man should engage in only two things: warfare and dancing. They excelled at both. Fulgrim lived among the nomads for a considerable time, adopting from them the art of fighting, dancing, and even music. It was the Sulfur who taught the Primarch the tricks of blacksmithing, which played a significant role in his future fate. But the wild nomadic people could not adapt to the changing times and threatened the ideal envisioned by Fulgrim. The Primarch had to set aside his feelings and destroy the Sulfur, thus depriving Chemos of its most populous tribe. He spared only a few young swordsmen, who subsequently became part of the Third Legion. However, the culture of the Sulfur was forgotten like many others. On the day when Fulgrim secured his final victory over the last of the rebels, he learned that the war of his entire life was merely a skirmish on the distant front of a grandiose confrontation. To Chemos came the Emperor, revealing to his son the truth about the grand destiny that awaited him as a majestic warlord. By that time, the planet had already become completely self-sufficient in resources and was ready to engage in external trade. Over 50 years of life on Chemos, Fulgrim revived the world from radioactive ash, restoring to people an understanding of art and other joys, not essential for survival, but necessary for full happiness. The Primarch himself resided in Spartanly modest chambers, not allowing himself any excesses. Along with the Master of Mankind, representatives of the Third Legion descended upon the planet, from which by that time only 200 Space Marines remained. Fulgrim received such a modest number of warriors for two reasons, and both were about to disappear shortly. The first was the indifferent attitude of Terran bureaucrats towards the lives of the Astartes. Legions, bereft of a Primarch, were sometimes thoughtlessly thrown by officials into the most dangerous operations. Because of this, the size of the units fell, and new recruits did not have time to gain sufficient experience before they were thrown into serious battles. In the case of other legions, high losses were somewhat offset by the influx of new recruits, but the Third Legion could not act in such a manner. A disaster, the causes of which still cannot be explained, destroyed the gene seed stocks and deprived the sons of Fulgrim the ability to maintain their numbers. According to one version, the Third Legion's material storage was infected with an unknown virus. According to another, a transporter with gene seed was stolen by Trazin the Infinite or another Xenos representative, who subsequently sold the stolen goods to the Lord of the Necrons. But whatever the reason for the loss of the gene seed, the fact remained that the Third Legion was nearly extinguished by the time their Primarch was discovered. At first, this circumstance slightly discouraged Fulgrim. He stepped out to his sons and inspired them with a fiery speech in which he promised a swift rise from the ashes and forthcoming victories in glory of the Emperor. However, later, when the Primarch learned about the achievements of his brothers, the helplessness of his own legion began to oppress him. The harsh conditions of upbringing taught Fulgrim that only the most persistent labor and flawless execution of the conceived could lead to triumph. Wishing to be the best in everything, the Primarch, imperceptibly to himself, became a follower of the idea of striving for perfection, which, as he believed, was still possible to achieve. An example of this was the Emperor, a figure who, in the very first moment, struck Fulgrim with his impeccability. Many Primarchs, upon meeting their father, did not immediately agree to accept the position of warlord of the Imperium, and sometimes even doubted the might of the master of mankind and attempted to fight him. Fulgrim immediately recognized the magnificence of the Emperor and understood that serving such a being could be a step towards his own perfection. The opportunities opened up after Chemos joined the Imperium allowed the Primarch to further enhance the well-being of its citizens. The planet not only stopped suffering from famine, but also gained access to resources that allowed the population to abandon enforced asceticism. Chemos actively joined the interplanetary trade, its economy significantly improved, and in culture, lavish festivals and sports games began to appear. Among the scholar factions, there's a myth that Fulgrim was arrogant and in no way interested in the life of mortals. However, the changes with Chemos suggest otherwise. The improvement of conditions at home with the help of acquired resources of the Imperium is a rare activity by Primarch standards. It is worth recalling that neither Medusa nor Barbarous and even Baal received any imperial innovations after acceptance of compliance. And many other Primarch worlds, similar to Caliban or Olympia, only lost millions of recruited citizens and underwent depressing changes, only exacerbating poverty. Chemos, on the other hand, became a point of attraction for artists dreaming of personally seeing the homeland of the most beautiful of the Primarchs. And soon its own creators began to appear on the planet. There is an opinion that during those years, music was created on the planet, which the followers of Fulgrim listened to even after millennia. Because of his activities on his home world, as well as the further transformation of the Legion, the Primarch received the nickname the Phoenix or the Phoenician, emphasizing his image as a bringer of rebirth. Immediately after the meeting, the Emperor delivered Fulgrim to Terra. It was necessary to take gene seed from the Primarch for the creation of new generations of space marines. The Third Legion, designated to the Phoenician, was called the Emperor's Children, and there are several official legends about this name, the truth of which everyone will determine for themselves. According to the first version, the Emperor was so impressed by Fulgrim's speech, addressed to the Space Marines upon introduction, that out of an excess of emotions, he gave the Legion such an honourable name and also allowed them to wear the image of Aquila on their cuirasses. The second legend tells of an early stage of the Great Crusade and a battle that occurred long before the discovery of the Primarch. There, in the Proxima region, the Emperor fought surrounded by warriors of the Adeptus Custodes and Space Marines of the Third Legion. At an unexpected moment, the rebels detonated a vortex bomb and severely injured the Emperor, nearly killing him. But the sons of Fulgrim fought so selflessly that, at the cost of huge losses, they managed to win time for the recovery of the Master of Mankind. Thanks to this, the battle ended successfully, and Proxima soon underwent exterminatus. On that day, the wounded Emperor presented the Third Legion with their own standard bearing the Palatine Aquila, and allowed the Space Marines to bear this symbol on their armour. At the same time, to underscore the force's exclusivity, the Master of Mankind granted the Space Marines the right to call themselves the Children of the Emperor. According to another version, the Aquila was received on the day of the conquest of Proxima, and the name was given to the Legion after the meeting with Fulgrim. Which of these stories is true is unlikely to be determined. However, what remains central here is that in all versions, the children of the Emperor are marked as outstanding warriors, deserving the particular favour of the Master of Mankind. This was probably partly due to surprise. It is hard to expect such self-sacrificing loyalty from those who were forcibly recruited. The galaxy counts many cultures that considered serving as an Astartes the highest honour possible. Yet, the first generation of the Emperor's children was not drawn from such societies. After the Unification Wars, the nascent Imperium took as tribute the firstborn of all noble houses of Europe. The best among these talented aristocrats were elevated and became Space Marines of the Third Legion. Undoubtedly, like most Astartes, the sons of Fulgrim overwhelmingly rejected memories of their past lives. Yet, throughout the existence of the Legion, some of them forgot their origins and looked down on their battle brothers from humble families. On Terra, Fulgrim embraced the Imperial culture and history and met the Primarchs already discovered. His meeting with Ferrus Manus, the stern lord of the Iron Hands legions, is considered significant. The positive differences in the brothers' appearances often lead inexperienced researchers to consider the Primarchs to be opposites of each other, but this is not the case. Ferrus Manus grew up on Medusa, a planet with a deadly climate and no less brutal culture, where the main principle was natural selection. The conditions on dying Chemos were somewhat similar, and Fulgrim, like Ferrus, understood well what it was like to create a society under such circumstances. However, the appearance of the Phoenician deceived the Primarch of the 10th Legion. At their first meeting, he mocked his brother, considering him weak. It is known that on Terra, Fulgrim came to a forge located beneath one of the Urals mountains. The Primarch declared his intention to create for himself a perfect weapon which would serve him in the Great Crusade. Hearing these words, Ferrus Manus laughed, considering that the pale hands of the Phoenician could not forge anything mighty. The Lord of the 10th proposed to Fulgrim to compare their craftsmanship, and the Phoenix accepted his challenge. Ferrus Manus was confident in his strength, as both he and his legion were already renowned in that period for their special predisposition towards the creation of technology and weapons. However, the Primarch of the Iron Hands was unaware that his brother, who had grown up in no less harsh conditions and had trained in blacksmithing among the sulfur, also possessed high skills and experience. According to legend, Ferrus and Fulgrim spent no less than 3 months at the anvil, during which they laboured over creating their own masterpieces. The creation of the Phoenician became the obsidian hammer forgebreaker, adorned with a golden aquila. It can be assumed that Fulgrim chose this weapon to underline his ability to fight not only with swords. Ferrus Manus, meanwhile, forged a golden sword whose blade burned with a golden flame. Sometime before this meeting, the Lord of the 10th had created a similar blade for Horus Lupercal. Subsequently, its fiery blade became the only source of light for a warrior who fell into a treacherous trap on Davin. Showing each other their creations, Ferrus and Fulgrim sincerely acknowledged the works as perfect. Without agreement, they exchanged weapons, thus demonstrating the highest trust that warriors can experience. The Phoenician called the Fireblade a sword worthy of Nuada Silverhand, a myth he had already managed to study. Likely the Primarch admired the deity of the ancient Celts for the similarity of their legends. Forgebreaker and Fireblade went through all the battles of the Great Crusade with their owners, reminding the Primarchs of friendship, loyalty, and honour. Aside from the Fireblade, Fulgrim at that time used Firebrand, a Volkite weapon with explosive rounds. The richly decorated Phoenix armour was created according to his own designs and matched the phenomenal agility and speed of the swordsman. Like any other brothers, the Primarchs tried to compete with each other in everything, so it was discovered in the early stages of the Great Crusade that Fulgrim was the most skilled duellist of all. This, as well as to some extent his haughty demeanour and love for intrigues, led to some of the Primarchs developing a dislike for the Phoenician. It is known about an altercation of Fulgrim with Jagatai Khan, which flared up because of a successful joke by Sanguinius. However, it's possible that the personal animosity between the Primarchs lay in significant similarities and a shared love for flamboyant appearance. The Hawk and the Phoenix preferred expensive fabrics and furs over armour, wove golden ornaments into their hair, were more concerned about their appearance than other warriors, and never missed a moment to make a sharp remark. The latter sometimes led them to quarrels with other Primarchs and each other. Fulgrim considered Ferrus Manus his closest brother. However, he also had a bond of trust with Horus. Their acquaintance occurred almost immediately after the discovery of the Phoenician. Since the Third Legion was too small to be considered a full military force, the Emperor ordered Fulgrim to join the expedition of the Lunar Wolves. The Phoenix spent the first 3 years serving the Imperium under the guidance of Horus. Lupercal treated Fulgrim with respect and taught him the methods of warfare in space. However, the Phoenician continued to desire independence from his elder brother's tutelage. While other Primarchs were conquering whole systems, his legion was barely noticeable against the backdrop of the Lunar Wolves. In the face of Robuta Guilliman's success, who had joined the Imperium just recently, Fulgrim consoled himself with the thought that the Lord of Ultramar had a vast legion, and all his achievements were justified by this. The Phoenician himself hoped to demonstrate his talents once the children of the Emperor reached a sufficient number for independent expeditions. However, Leman Russ, aware of his brother's anxieties, once boasted that he managed to capture a planet with just 800 space marines, implying that the low numbers of the Legion could no longer serve as an excuse for the children of the Emperor's failures. The words of the Wolf King did not give Fulgrim peace. He began to ponder how to escape the status of a Primarch who is not respected but pitied. The Phoenix believed he had fully grasped the Emperor's design and could earn his approval by demonstrating efficiency. This concept was utterly distasteful to the Phoenician, but for the sake of the father, he was prepared to sacrifice part of his own ideals. The perfect moment for Fulgrim to implement his plan came during the operation to bring the planet Byzus into compliance. This was one of the very first independent missions of the children of the Emperor, who had not yet managed to establish a reputation as conquerors. Byzus was a civilized world whose culture had first achieved a certain progress, but by the time it encountered the Imperial forces, had degenerated to feudalism. The entire southern hemisphere of the planet had been turned into radioactive wastelands, resulting from a nuclear war. Since then, these regions were populated exclusively by mutants, united in small clans. These frail beings made no contribution to the economy, paying for their ancestors' weakness with diseases and gradual extinction. Conditions were no better in the far north. There, the majority of people were driven into mines and manufactory, where they were treated as rightless slaves. Long shifts, lack of rest, medical care, and adequate nutrition, as well as regular beatings from the overseers, turned the life of the common populace into hell, naturally leading to regular uprisings. However, regions located along the equatorial belt lived relatively prosperously. Peasants who were engaged in growing grapes for the famous Byzaskan wine also suffered from hunger and beatings. But their owners, also residing in the central belt, faced no hardships. The hereditary governor of Byzus, Pandion IV, was a pitiable figure even by the standards of autocrats. The decrepit and sickly old man could no longer cope with the system he had built in his early years. Those surrounding him had degraded so much that they engaged in covert wars with each other, not even understanding the purposes for which they fought. Corruption and thoughtless use of resources led the planet to a series of technogenic disasters, climate deterioration, and the outbreak of fires. Riots of the impoverished populace erupted widely, which were still suppressed by the enforcers. But even this tool was on the verge of its destruction. According to Fulgrim's calculations, Byzus was to destroy itself within the next 15 years. Bringing to agreement a planet with such backward technologies did not require vast resources. But the Phoenician decided to perform this task at the hardest level, to impress his father and silence his boastful brothers. The Primarch devised a plan according to which Byzus had to submit to the forces of just 6 space marines. Besides, the Phoenix intended to show no ships except for the Stormbirds, so as not to frighten the population with imperial might. According to Fulgrim's plan, he was to achieve agreement within just 1 month, using only diplomatic methods. Before his landing on the planet, the Primarch sent the hereditary governor information about the Imperium, its goals, and the conditions under which Byzus could become part of the realm of humanity. The intentions of Fulgrim did not sit well with the plutocrats, who saw in the acceptance of agreement a threat to their privileged position. Realizing that after joining the Imperium, their personal wealth might disappear, the noble factions began planning resistance. When the Primarch landed on Byzus, he was met by a crowd of enthusiastic citizens, as well as Governor Pandion and his entourage. Observing the grim faces of the plutocrats, Fulgrim mentally noted the most dissatisfied ones to take necessary actions later. The planet's ruler seemed pitiable and unpleasant to the Primarch. However, it was with him that diplomatic relations had to be established. For this purpose, the governor organized a reception in his palace, where it was boastfully admitted to Fulgrim that, for the sake of a lavish evening, several villages were left hungry. At the reception, a Phoenician made the acquaintance of the Chancellor of the Continental Government, Belarus Corinth. This relatively young politician appealed to the Primarch with a similar outlook on societal structure and a desire for the development of the entire planet, not just its wealthiest part. Fulgrim planned to improve the living and working conditions for the rural population, weaken the grip of the patricians on highly productive industrial farms and enrichment factories, and then start a series of reforms aimed at strengthening the continental government. The latter was supposed to liberate power from the influence of the archaic caste system, beneficial exclusively to a handful of plutocrats. The Primarch hinted to Chancellor Corinth that he would support him if the man agreed to make the government the main body of authority. However, the Primarch's proposal was misunderstood, likely because Corinth did not think it possible to improve the existing system without radical changes in the upper echelons of society. Fulgrim hoped for rapid acceptance and subsequent gradual transformation of Bizas. However, the entire picture, though unhealthy, of a still united system shattered the moment the Primarch spoke with Governor Pandion. An armed assassin attempted to shoot the corrupt politician attacking the elder. Fulgrim caught the bullet mid-air, tossed it into his goblet, and declared the evening definitively ruined. His wine was tainted with no less than 10 different poisons, indicating how disunited and foolish the warring plutocrat clans were. The system had degraded too severely and could not serve as a support for the authority of the Imperium. It would be nothing for the Primarch to dispatch several units of Space Marines and regiments of the Palatine Sentinels to Bizas, before leaving behind his own governor and the necessary contingent, as was usually done. However, in this case, Fulgrim would have had to deviate from his plan of perfect harmony by the power of 6 Astartes. The Phoenician had painted himself into a corner that forced him to act against rationality. Yet soon, members of a secret society who followed the teachings of the mythical Sabazius approached the Primarch. People in masks told the Phoenician that they wished for the world to prosper and planned to rid it of the tyranny of a rotten top. Their ideas and philosophy appealed to the Primarch, and the legend of Sabazius resonated with the story of Fulgrim, who brought water in the myths of Chemos. From the reports of his sons, the Phoenician already knew about the dire state of simple agrarians and workers on Bizas. Thus, the emergence of an organization wanting to quickly overthrow the oppressors was a natural process. Members of the Sabazian Brotherhood not only planned the overthrow of the ruling elite, but also honed their combat skills and philosophy. Their combat techniques reminded the Primarch of the destroyed sulphurs, though they differed with a certain elegance. Fulgrim was so impressed by what he learned in the treatises of the Sabazians that he subsequently even incorporated some of their techniques into the training of the Emperor's children legionnaires. The ideals and goals of the Sabazian Brotherhood were close to the Phoenician, yet he could not take their side and assist with the planet's conquest. The problem lay in that very efficiency the Primarch sought to achieve for the approval of his father and recognition from his brothers. Had Fulgrim allowed himself to use the full might of the Legion and Palatine Sentinels, the planet would have been under his control in less than a month. But in that case, it would not be possible to boast of world capture with just 6 warriors. Moreover, the Sabazians would not have been able to build a new, albeit much more just, system quickly, and the process of consent would have been delayed. In a plan where a squad of just 6 Astartes and the Primarch joins the planet to the Imperium in a month, only one option was viable. Fulgrim had to support the already existing system and add resilience to it. The Primarch disliked the current regime, the bloated class of plutocrats, and the Governor Pandion, already incapable of anything. But the Phoenix found no other way to achieve his goals. Fulgrim faced a choice which the Chancellor Corinth voiced: do what you think is right, or fulfill your duty. The achievements of other Primarchs, even those found after him, who achieved greater success, weighed on the Phoenix, while all the significant achievements of the Third Legion happened before meeting his father. The lack of achievements, the mockery of brothers, and the desire to earn the Emperor's praise were on one side of the scale, with what made Fulgrim himself, with his aspiration to help those in need of protection. Overcoming doubts, the Phoenician decided to support the hereditary governor Pandion. With the help of the iterators, the ruling family's arrest was falsified, triggering the activity of some plutocrats who attempted to seize power. Fulgrim's wars destroyed the most prominent opposition leaders, and the returned Pandion demonstratively granted forgiveness to all the others. After this, those whose loyalty to the governor was wavering now became exceptionally devoted and continued to live, preserving their privileged status. The Sabazian Brotherhood was personally destroyed by Fulgrim. The rebels still hoped to persuade the Primarch, reminding him of his own beliefs, and when that failed, they decided to detonate a nuclear bomb. The Sabazians were ready to die along with the Phoenix, as they did not want to see a world where people continue to suffer. But the Primarch neutralized the bomb, remembering what Ferrus Manus had taught him, and then returned to the capital, where he captured the last of the rebels. One of them turned out to be Chancellor Corinth, to whom Fulgrim had offered to lead the planet during their first meeting. At that time, the man had refused, understanding that without changing the entire system, he could not make the transformations that the Sabazius Brotherhood had planned for Bezus. Corinth himself knelt before the Primarch and offered him to cut off his own head. He, like the other Sabazians, did not want to see a world where people continue to exist as slaves. Fulgrim promised that prosperity lay ahead for Bezus, but whether the Primarch believed his own words is hard to say. The hereditary governor Pandion remained in power, which gained new strength with the support of the Imperium, and the agreement was concluded within the necessary deadline. Fulgrim inscribed his name in the history of the Imperium with a feat unprecedented before and achieved the desired outcome. Other Primarchs immediately sent messages to their brother, recognizing his merits, and possibly even Lemon Russ himself, who had unwittingly planted a similar idea in Fulgrim, changed his opinion about the Phoenician. However, the triumph did not bring the Primarch the expected joy. By refusing the chance for Bezus to change and allowing Governor Pandion to eradicate the dissatisfied, Fulgrim justified himself by saying that victories come at a cost. But it was these very words that Terran officials used to justify their indifferent treatment of the Third Legionnaires when they carelessly spent their lives. Trying to be better than the rest, the Phoenician behaved like those he despised. One of the first full-fledged missions of the Emperor's children was the conquest of the planet Leren. Contact with the inhabitants of this world occurred when one of the advanced reconnaissance ships of the Third Legion detected signs of civilization in the vicinity of the Twin Star, and then determined that there had formed a highly developed society. At first, the Xenos race did not show open hostility to the Imperial forces, but when a squad of scouts was sent to their world, the Lerens demonstrated determined resistance. The aliens' small but powerful military fleet attacked the reconnaissance ships and destroyed them all, without suffering any losses themselves. From the limited information that was able to be gathered before the fatal encounter, the scouts were only able to learn that the population calls their planet Leren, and the technology of this civilization could match, and even in some aspects surpass, Imperial technology. Terran bureaucrats concluded that conquering a planet of such a developed race could be too long and costly an endeavor, and thus, at the current moment, it was logical to turn Leren into a protectorate of the Imperium. But Fulgrim rejected these arguments, asserting that only humanity was capable of prosperity, and all other races had no right to possess technologies and ideas of a similar level. The Primarch declared that the Lerens deserved nothing but total annihilation, and the Third Legion commenced the cleansing. Likely, such zeal from Fulgrim was partly due to the fact that the universal quest for perfection among the Xenos race offended the Phoenix. From space, Leren resembled a giant sapphire. Covered with water, the planet had almost lost its land when the ice at its poles melted. Most of the Xenos lived in coral cities, atolls floating in the sky. From the endless ocean that occupied almost the entire surface of the world, individual peaks protruded once the tops of the highest mountains. These islands were to become the launch points for all attacks by the Emperor's children. Both the floating atolls and the terrestrial structures of the Lerans were made of a nearly weightless but durable material, piquing the interest of Imperial forces. The buildings themselves were something between towers made of transparent corals and the shells of sea mollusks. The structures emitted a loud humming that soon after the battle began disabled VoxLink. The realization that the Xenos were capable not only of resistance, but also of destroying Imperial technologies, stirred in Fulgrim an even more ferocious desire to exterminate the Lerans. Externally, the local inhabitants resembled reptiles, although their heads had fast eyes and mandibles, more fitting for insects. Most often, the Imperial forces encountered tall, flexible Lerans with snake-like lower bodies, as well as with developed chest cavities and 2 pairs of arms. The upper limbs gripped power blades, while the lower ones were clad in gloves that fired energy charges. Heads with enormous jaws could emit an unpleasant sound during an attack, the force of which significantly slowed down the actions of the Space Marines for a time, losing their orientation in space. Powerful weaponry combined with armor made the Lerans formidable opponents, but these individuals were not typical representatives of the species. The civilization of the Lerans had reached a high level of technological development, including in genetic engineering. If necessary, the Xenos could easily reconfigure their own bodies, adapting them to the environment or type of activity. Those Lerans who lived in floating cities, atolls, had wings and the ability to fly, while the inhabitants of the sea cities possessed organs that allowed them to breathe underwater. Due to their multitude, not all types of these Xenos were recorded in the archives of the Imperium. Although it is known that both the dead and the living were delivered to the apothecarian of the Emperor's children for study. In his quest to enhance the physical perfection of the Astartes, the chief apothecary of the Third Legion, Fabius Bile, with the consent of the Primarch, used the knowledge obtained from the bodies of the Lerans to develop a series of modified gene seed organs. Since there was almost no land left on the planet, the capture of atolls was to be the key to success for the entire campaign. According to Fulgrim's plan, victory required the occupation of ground bastions and the disabling of energy sources within them, which kept the floating cities aloft. The operation on Leran was conducted with cruel and merciless methods, reflecting the Primarch's ambition to erase from history those beings unworthy, who dared to share his own ideas. Victory in each battle was bought with the lives of many of the Emperor's children, but the speed of action and results highlighted the Phoenicians' genius. The captured atolls were immediately turned into military bases for subsequent operations and held by Archithian squads, while the Astartes continued the campaign. Fulgrim's plan was calculated to the smallest detail, and all attempts by the Lerans to defend themselves led to nothing. The war for the planet was fought on many locations. The legionnaires battled on atolls floating in the skies, in the ruins of ancient cities on the flooded mountaintops, and made their way through the water to citadels hidden in the ocean depths. At the beginning of the invasion, the cities in the air seemed to the Emperor's children as independent formations, drifting above the ocean surface without a clear system. However, it later became clear that all atolls moved within a circle, the center of which was a certain sky city. It was not the largest or the most beautifully equipped, but its significance among the others was obvious. Fulgrim's advisors suggested that the government of Leran might be hiding on the main atoll, but the Primarch rejected this theory upon barely glancing at the presented data. The Phoenician immediately understood that the central city was not a seat of power, but a place of universal worship. But neither Fulgrim nor his sons at that moment had yet to guess the existence of the Chaos Gods, and failed to recognize in the culture of the Lerans the influence of Slanesh. Therefore, having found themselves, after the final massacre in the sanctuary of the Xenos, the Emperor's children did not understand the danger they faced. The interior of the temple was illuminated by dazzling rays, lost in the thunderous echo of mad music. The rooms were filled with dizzying smells, and on the floor, under a layer of coloured fog, bodies writhed. The rustling noise produced by the colliding skins of Lerans seemed to the present legionnaires as the most horrific sound imaginable. Witnessing the repulsive union of many Xenos, the children of the Emperor wondered why the enemies had not joined the other Lerans who had defended the sanctuary to the last. The Primarch, however, immediately noticed among the writhing bodies a stone slab, where a sword with a slightly curved blade rested, a special weapon around which the Xenos had erected a temple. Even without knowledge of chaos and the existence of the supernatural, among the sons of Fulgrim, there were those who understood. The Lerans were not simply worshipping the silver blade, but were bound to it by an unexplainable dependency. Yet the Primarch felt no similar danger. He fearlessly walked over the bodies of the Xenos to the center of the hall, took the mysterious sword in his hands, and placed the Legion's banner in its place. The find was truly magnificent. The blade was smaller in size compared to the gift from Ferrus Manus, but not in finesse. The weapon had a perfect balance. Its blade could easily cleave ceramite, and its hilt, adorned with a precious stone, fit the Primarch as if the sword had been crafted specifically for him. But behind the beauty of the blade lay a terrible truth. It was a vessel for a demon of Slaanesh. As soon as Fulgrim seized the sword, the thoughts of the servant of the Prince of Pleasure, who sought to sway the Primarch to chaos, invaded his mind. After the victory on Leran, the Phoenician began to notice foreign thoughts in his consciousness more often. Bitter grievances of which he had previously been unaware would spontaneously emerge in his mind. At night, lying in his bed, Fulgrim seemed to hear a voice whispering now seductive fantasies, now the most terrible of nightmares. At first, the Primarch suspected that he was going mad due to some influence of the Lerans which began to destroy his sanity after the victory. But he dismissed this relatively accurate guess, as he was convinced that no one could influence the Emperor of Mankind's perfect creation. The Primarch then thought that he might be receiving astropathic messages, but remembered he had no psychic abilities. Eventually, Fulgrim concluded that the voice in his head was simply an expression of the subconscious, one facet of the mind that could formulate its thoughts independently of the Phoenix's will. If anyone could boast of having a wise and impartial advisor in their own head, then, in the opinion of Fulgrim, it had to be a Primarch. In this way, calming himself, the Phoenician grew accustomed to the presence of the external voice, which he never recognized as the demon. It is known that chaos cannot penetrate a healthy soul. He needed to find a vulnerability, a weak spot, one that could harbor the seed of an alien idea. In the case of Fulgrim, such vulnerability was his pride and at the same time a sense of his own imperfection. On one hand, the Primarch was confident in his uniqueness. On the other, he considered himself not flawless enough. This, combined with the desire to impress the father and surpass his brothers, led the Phoenix into the embrace of the dark gods. In the days when Fulgrim seized the blade of the Lair, in another region of the galaxy, the Legion of Ferrus Manus encountered a civilization listed in imperial sources as Diasporex. This was a confederation consisting of many united races and cultures. Humans coexisted amiably in an alliance with Xenos, developing a common state with mutual support. The 10th Legion unveiled the imperial truth to the human part of Diasporex and proposed that people sever their interaction with Xenos for joining the realm of mankind. However, the proposal was rejected, and the Iron Hands were forced to start a war. For 5 months, the fleet of Diasporex found ways to simply hide from battles, and did it so skillfully that it caused reluctant admiration even among the experienced captains of the 10th Legion. Ferrus Manus himself said that the extermination of these enemies would be a tragedy for humanity, but could do nothing about the foolishness of traitors who chose an alliance with Xenos over the Imperium. Nonetheless, victory was still far off. The enemy's skill was so high that the Gorgon had to ask for reinforcements. They were the Emperor's children and Fulgrim, arriving to help his best friend. Together the two legions attacked the ships of Diasporex, which for some mysterious reason did not leave their positions and did not retreat to safer regions. However, soon the Phoenix guessed that the enemies could not escape due to the fuel generators located at their positions. In the process of one of the final battles, the battleship Iron Fist suddenly occupied the space between Fulgrim's flagship and the attacking ship of Diaspore. The Phoenix ordered an overly rash maneuver and would likely have perished if not for the selfless act of Ferrus Manus. However, the fact that the brother risked his life and literally shielded the pride of the Emperor with his body was invaluable. Fulgrim saw in the act of Ferrus' braggadocio an attempt to insult, demonstrate superiority, and steal victory. For many years of their friendship, the Phoenix and the Gorgon had saved each other's lives more than once, and until the incident with Diasporex, there was no malicious rivalry between them. But due to the demon that had taken residence in the mind of Phoenician, even the most noble actions and words of Ferrus Manus began to be interpreted as something vile and offensive. Fulgrim failed to notice the feat his brother had accomplished for him. At the end of the war with the Diasporex, the United Legions lured the enemies into battle near the star Corolis and finally annihilated the remnants of the opponent's fleet. Then, the found-alive Xenos were exterminated, and the humans of the Confederation were sent to the nearest Imperial world, where they were met with the fate of slaves. Soon after the end of this mission, the Emperor's sons encountered the craft world Ulthwi, which greeted the Primarch on behalf of Eldrad Ulthran. The Xenos seer claimed that he wanted to share extremely important information, upon which the fate of the galaxy supposedly depended. Over several days, the Emperor's Pride and Ulthwi exchanged messages via Vox in attempts to arrange a meeting between Eldrad Ulthran and Fulgrim. The problem was that neither side wanted to allow a delegation of strangers aboard their craft. In the end, the negotiations concluded with the Seer's proposal for a meeting on the surface of the neutral world Tarsus. The Primarch liked this idea, and after several days, the humans and Eldari finally began to communicate directly. The Phoenician descended to the surface in a form already distinguished from his usual appearance. Like theatrical actors, the Primarch applied layers of powder to his face as well as kohl, which adorned his eyelids and cheekbones with patterns. The Eldaris, seeing the son of the Emperor for the first time, could not notice the difference from his past form, while the loyal Space Marines only pondered for a moment. Eldrad Ulthran foresaw that Fulgrim was destined for the greatest role in the upcoming bloody drama, but which side the Primarch would choose remained a mystery. Therefore, the seer deemed it necessary to try and warn the Emperor's son. However, the risk Ulthran took for the possible prevention of terrible events turned out to be unjustified. Fulgrim did not heed the words about being currently betrayed by companions and that Horus is wounded in the Temple of Davin. The mention of the Chaos Gods, demons, and the supposedly danger of the warp were empty sounds to the Primarch, shocking the Eldari seer. Ulthran was astounded that after millennia of space travel, humanity had still not recognized the true nature of the Immaterium. Enraged, Fulgrim lunged at the Elder, drawing a blade of the lair, in which the seer immediately sensed the presence of a demon. Deciding that the Emperor's children had already succumbed to the corruption of chaos, Eldrad Ulthran commanded his warriors to return to the ship. Their retreat was covered by the ghostly Lord Kirain Goldhelm, whom Fulgrim destroyed single-handedly. After that, new forces of the Eldaris materialized on the planet, including an avatar of their ancient god of war, Cain. Clad in burning iron, the giant attacked the Primarch with a fiery spear, but his maneuver was too slow for the Emperor's creation. The Eldari deity attacked Fulgrim with wild fury, its strike driven by ancient hatred for the foreigner and pleasure in long-awaited freedom. The Avatar's body was illuminated by fire and accompanied by dense clouds of smoke mixed with ash. The blazing spear collided with the blade of the lair, and the sounds of the impacts with terrifying thunder shook the spectators. But no matter how strong the opponent was, in the course of the battle, Fulgrim began to feel boiling anger. The enemy, whom he had almost considered an equal, proved incapable of anything other than foolish and predictable attacks. The Eldari deity could only kill. It did not understand the art of battle, did not see the elegance of movement and the beauty of the strikes. The Primarch decided that such a limited creature had no right to exist, after which his hands were filled with new energy. Moments later, Fulgrim hurled the blade of the lair like a spear, then hit the distracted avatar of Cain with a punch. When the giant's body swayed, the Primarch jumped on it and began to strangle him. Despite his hands blackening from the burning armor of the deity, the Phoenician did not loosen his deadly grip. Laughing and forgetting about the pain, he looked into the eyes of the dying enemy and experienced incredible ecstasy at the thought that he was capable of depriving a mighty god of life. At the moment when the avatar of Cain ceased to exist, Fulgrim was surrounded by a noise comparable to the birth of a supernova. The fire of the deity's death surged to the heavens and threw the Primarch high into the air. The freed essence of Cain enveloped the Primarch, slipped under the armor and absorbed into the skin. Then the Phoenician saw a gigantic vortex in the depth of space. The destruction of countless stars and planets, the extermination of an entire race, and the birth of a terrible god. Cain endowed Fulgrim with the memory and knowledge of thousands of centuries. From the dark void of which the Primarch was revealed the word Slanesh. Hearing this name, the Primarch fell to his knees and smiled. His head was battered, his bones broken, and his face scorched. But the Phoenix laughed with happiness at being alive as never before. The Primarch was not concerned with the screams of the Astartes trying to bring their father to his senses, nor the hands lifting him from the ground. But as soon as Fulgrim realized he no longer held the hilt of the blade of the lair, he jumped to his feet in one jerk. As expected, the blade stuck in the place it had been thrown during the battle. However, approaching it, the Phoenician stopped. Now in the Primarch's mind were alien memories of the birth of the Dark God, which awakened remnants of will. Phoenix, from whose scorched body hung shreds of skin and flesh, halted the hand already stretched towards the blade of the lair. But the chance to break free from the deleterious influence was not used. The voice from the sword promised that only it could help Fulgrim achieve perfection, and filled the Primarch's mind with visions of triumph. In that moment, the barely revived will of Phoenix ceased its resistance. Grabbing the hilt of the sword, the Primarch immediately ceased to feel the pain of wounds and melancholy, and his body was filled with new energy. Returning to the pride of the Emperor, Fulgrim ordered the virologic bombing of the world Tarsus. After that, Fulgrim set off to meet with Horus, who by that time had already experienced the influence of the destructive forces. The words of Lupercal about the Emperor's betrayal enraged the Phoenician. The father was an ideal for him, and the dreams in which Fulgrim reached the same strength and perfection had lately become the meaning of his existence. The Primarch demanded his brother stop the monstrous speeches, but Horus continued, presenting more and more arguments in his favor. Lupercal's words penetrated into the vulnerabilities in Fulgrim's soul created by the blade of the lair, definitively turning him away from the Emperor. Having listened to Horus, Phoenix only asked how he could assist his brother in the uprising against the father. Since at this stage the warrior was actively gathering supporters from among the other Primarchs, Fulgrim was tasked with convincing Ferrus Manus to join the rebels. Horus did not hope that Gorgon could see the truth, but the Phoenician assured him otherwise. On the way to the Iron Hand's fleet, he was greatly worried about the upcoming talk, terrified that he might forever destroy a long friendship. However, Fulgrim could not but try, for otherwise Ferrus Manus would face destruction. Preparing for the meeting, the Phoenician intentionally brought with him the fire blade, not the blade of the lair, which he had previously carried without removing. Thus, the Primarch hoped to remind his brother that their friendship had lasted for more than 200 years, and therefore his words about the Emperor deserved trust. And yet, Fulgrim's anxieties were noticeable even to the far from perspicacious Ferrus Manus. Phoenician tried to start the conversation from afar, to not provoke the volatile Primarch into rage, but this failed. Hardly had he heard his brother accusing the Emperor of betrayal, Ferrus Manus grabbed for his warhammer. Gorgon refused to consider any arguments, believing that only a traitor could accuse the Emperor. Fulgrim, however, felt loyal to himself, since Ferrus Manus had neglected their friendship and did not choose the side that Phoenix considered correct. The conversation turned into a fight, during which Ferrus broke the fireblade given to him by his brother. He squeezed the blade with his silver hands, heated it, and exploded it with such power that the Primarchs were thrown in different directions. But Fulgrim was less harmed and came to his senses faster, managing to pick up the forge breaker from the floor. He raised the hammer over Ferrus and could not strike. Phoenician once again reproached his brother, saying that he would go to death for him, and therefore felt betrayed, seeing that Gorgon was not able to do the same. But Ferrus Manus was unwavering in his loyalty to the Emperor. He replied that from that moment on, he no longer considered Fulgrim a brother. Cruel words wounded Phoenix, and he struck the former friend with the hammer. Phoenician calculated the force intentionally to knock out, but not to kill. The remnants of memories of friendship still did not allow him to wish for his brother's death. After the fight, Fulgrim fled to his ship, leaving the fragments of the fireblade in Ferrus Manus's quarters and taking the forgebreaker with him. It is known that for the next 2 weeks the Primarch of the Iron Hands did not show himself to his sons, healing physical and mental wounds. Like other traitor Primarchs, Fulgrim chose from his legion's sons whose loyalty to the Emperor he did not doubt. These noble warriors were deceived by their own father, who sent them to certain death in the ruins of Coral City of Istvan III. It was assumed that none of the loyal Space Marines of the 3rd Legion would survive the viral bombardment. At the same time, the demon imprisoned in the blade of the lair continued to exert its deadly influence on the Emperor's children. Legionnaires, as well as mortals with vulnerabilities in their souls, succumbed to corruption and committed terrible acts they could not have previously imagined. Travelling artists of the Emperor's pride resorted to murder, believing that the colours they needed could only be procured from human bodies. And musicians created new instruments, using the flesh of former comrades in their work. Those Space Marines who succumbed to chaos engaged in self-torture, including regular skin cutting and participation in Fabius Bile's experiments. During that period, the chief apothecary of the Emperor's children created the first Marines with organs implanted from Lairans, which allowed the use of vocal cords as a noise weapon. The apotheosis of the fall of the 3rd Legion was Maraviglia, a musical concert by the composer Bekwa Kinska, which turned into a ritual of summoning the demons of Slanesh. During the performance, Madame Kinska handed some of the Space Marines the musical instruments she had created. Indeed, her creations produced sounds, but the deadly cacophony only remotely resembled music. The Astartes, who had undergone modification by Fabius Bile and received instruments from the hands of Bekwa Kinska, were called Noise Marines, after the climax of Maraviglia. The first battle of this detachment took place on Istvan V. The Emperor's children were at the forefront of the battle, ruthlessly cutting down their former brethren. The infamous massacre at the landing zone became an example of unprecedented violence and cruelty. But amid the blazing battlefield, where Marines from 11 legions fought, were 2 warriors thinking only of dueling each other: Phoenix and Gorgon. In the smoke, shining like gold above the slaughter, rose Fulgrim. Gorgon searched for his brother's eyes and awaited the final battle with him. Rage boiled in his soul, and his heart was torn with pain. May retribution fall upon the Phoenix, and let the warp take him away. For many months without fear, he repeated vows of vengeance. It was not the hammer that felled the Primarch, but the closest one who betrayed. Fulgrim, in contrast, was amused. Only for a moment did the sharp sword tremble. In Gorgon's eyes gleamed mad rage, capable of burning, and thunder roared over Istvan. From the fury of 2 demigods, rage roared like an ocean, washing away brotherly love. The weapons, once created as a sign of friendship, were returned and reforged. The killed will be a friend, no, an enemy. Not hearing the noise of the forgotten battle, they shattered armor on brother by brother, and here they are, almost killed, standing, having knelt. Fulgrim's armor was pierced by a sword, but he weeps not from pain, but from the harm of his own power, by which Gorgon was struck. "My brother, my friend," whispered the miserable, "it's not me, I did not want it." But in the battle, there was another participant who possessed the body of the Phoenix. The blade of the lair, swifter than sight, soared up, but held back the blow. In the lakes of his brother's eyes, Fulgrim read all the truth. As Ferrus, risking his life by ship, came to help the nearly perished, how they met afterward. The vision of bottomless truth, though lasting for eons, was replaced by reality, where Gorgon was struck down by a brother's hand. Going mad from his own pain, Fulgrim in the nightmare watched how the sword raised by his hand and the brother fell headless. Throughout all days and all worlds, the sufferings of millions of years were accepted by Fulgrim as cruel punishment at the body of Ferrus. Throne of Terror, what have I done? Father, save me, I beg. But the pain knew no bounds, and a new voice eclipsed the noise. Your brother loved you boundlessly and valued you infinitely, yet you, with your contemptuous hand, destroyed a shard of the sun. Unable to listen to the whispers of creatures spawned by wicked hell, the killer directed the sword to his heart, which his best brother had made. No, protested the abominations, mere death will not save here. Accept me, you are so tormented, oblivion will come to you. To forget and to shed the burden of pain? Let's finish. I will give myself to you, said Fulgrim, and immediately realized that he had fallen into a trap again. But it was too late. The creature stole the body, and he was silently locked within it, cursed to weep madly forever until the end of days. And the abomination, enjoying the moan as sweet as a tear, with Fulgrim's face at the Gorgons, drank the eyes with a smile. Phoenix beheaded the father of Iron Hands with a blade of the lair, although throughout the battle before that he fought with the Forgebreaker. He took the hammer with him, which he once forged for his brother, to underline the end of their friendship. For the same reason, Ferrus Manus went to meet the Phoenix with the Fireblade, restored from shards especially for the duel of vengeance. The demon from the blade of the lair, having taken control of Fulgrim's body in a moment of weakness, had no intention of returning control to the Primarch. After the battle on Istvan V, when the leader of the Third Legion met with Horus, the unborn in his body revealed its true nature to the warrior. The demon explained to the Lupercal that the real Fulgrim would never renounce the Emperor and would not support the forces of the traitor legions, and therefore it was in Horus's interest not to tell about the enslavement of the brother to others. The warrior realized that the Phoenician, trapped in his own mind, was suffering endlessly, but he didn't want to look for ways to free him and agreed to cooperate with the demon. However, at the next council of the traitor Primarchs, Lorgar noticed the presence of the unborn. Aurelian considered this outrageous because in his understanding demons were supposed to coexist harmoniously with those into whose bodies they had invaded, as was the case with the Galvorbak legionaries. Fulgrim, however, was enslaved and deprived of the freedom of action by the creature from the warp, which in the opinion of Lorgar was an abomination. The Primarch promised to find out the real name of the unborn and one day drive it from Fulgrim's body. But upon returning to the pride of the Emperor, the demon finally took control over the body and moved the consciousness of the Phoenix into his portrait, painted by a deranged artist. The painting was placed in a hall where once the Maraviglia unfolded and which had since been forbidden to enter. For several months the Primarch's soul dwelled inside the forgotten portrait, realizing and experiencing all the horrors wrought by Fulgrim. During this period, the most perceptive of the Emperor's children began to notice oddities and suspected the presence of an impostor pretending to be their father. United, the Space Marines managed to immobilize Fulgrim, but during the interrogations it became apparent that they had erred. Mysteriously, the Phoenician outwitted the demon and trapped it in the portrait, regaining control over his own body. However, a series of horrific trials and tragic errors unsettled the Primarch's mind. Fulgrim had changed so profoundly that he surpassed even the demon who had sought to usurp his identity in cruelty. Soon, after voluntarily submitting to the authority of Slanesh, the Primarch met with the Lord of the Iron Warriors, Perturabo. Fulgrim promised his brother a mysterious weapon, Angel Exterminatus, which was to tip the scales of the uprising in favor of Horus. In the process of demonstrating his plan on the stage of a grand theatre, the Phoenician was shot in the head by Nicona Sharokin, but survived thanks to the efforts of Fabius Bile. Fulgrim's true intent was to sacrifice Perturabo to Slanesh and subsequently ascend. To deceive his brother, the The Phoenician gifted him a cloak with a precious gem that gradually sapped the vitality of the Fourth Legion's lord. Due to the unexpected intervention of loyalist saboteurs, Fulgrim's plan did not unfold as intended. The stone was shattered, and Perturabo managed to defeat his brother. But the destruction of the physical body marked the beginning of the ascension for which everything had been orchestrated. Fulgrim transformed into a gigantic serpent-like monster with 2 pairs of arms and massive wings. Only now, with his purple skin, demonic spikes on his head and throughout his body, did the Phoenician feel truly perfect. He promised Perturabo a swift reunion and disappeared in a teleportation flash along with his entire legion. In the following months of the heresy, Fulgrim continued to communicate with the War Master, agreeing to send the Emperor's children on one task or another, but the legion effectively lost its military might. The Phoenix distanced himself from battles, devoting his time entirely to amusements in the warp, and his sons were left to fend for themselves. To return Fulgrim to participation in the war, Lorgar Aurelian, with the word-bearers, set out for the palace of Slanesh. But tearing the Phoenician away from the decadence and degeneration in the company of the demon Nkari, whom the Primarch called a spouse, proved challenging. The ascended Phoenix lost the concept of time, and as befits one who has spent long in the warp, did not understand what century was current in the real space. Fulgrim was surprised to hear that the War of Horus had not yet ended, although, as he himself said, such trifles no longer concerned him. In the course of conversation, the Phoenician mocked Lorgar, astonishing him with knowledge known to the demon prince, and had absolutely no intention of leaving the Palace of Pleasure. However, when the word-bearer pronounced the name Fulgrim received upon becoming a demon prince, everything changed. The Phoenix was forced to obey, gather the scattered bands of his sons into a single legion, and go to war. Lorgar subjugated his brother not only to return to the uprising, but also to use his help to overthrow Horus from his position as the War Master of Chaos. Aurelian's plan failed. Lupercal learned of the betrayal, and the word-bearer whose will Fulgrim was under freed the Primarch from his influence. Despite no longer being bound, the Phoenician remained by the War Master's side and continued his participation in the heresy, though his legion hardly brought any benefit. The Emperor's children landed on Terra along with the rest of the traitor forces, but mainly engaged in murdering and torturing the civilian populace. Fulgrim himself spent time provoking Angron into fits of rage for his own amusement. The War Master entrusted the Phoenician with an attack on the southeastern part of the Imperial Palace's walls, but the Emperor's children were unable to breach the psychic shield established there, and returned again to terrorizing the mortals. At the Council of Traitor Primarchs, Fulgrim mocked Perturabo, and in the final part of the Siege of Terra did the same with Rogel Dawn. Fighting the Primarch of the Imperial Fists, the Phoenix learned that the palace storm had failed, and deemed further participation in the battle too boring. Assuming his demonic form, the Phoenician returned to the warp. The fate of his sons and the outcome of the war for Terra did not concern him at all. Fulgrim's next appearance occurred 100 years after the end of the heresy during the battle at Thessaly, where the Primarch encountered Robut Guilliman. The Lord of Ultramar came to avenge his brother for his betrayal, but did not anticipate how powerful a demon prince could be. The mere scent emanating from the Phoenician was enough to knock a space marine off his feet and shake the Primarch. Fulgrim easily overpowered Guilliman, slashing his throat with a poisoned blade. The sons managed to teleport their father to a safe place, saving the Lord of Ultramar from death. However, the 10,000 years spent by Guilliman in stasis proved to be no less a terrible retribution for overconfidence. The children of the Emperor believed that Slanesh granted Fulgrim a world of pleasures, where he could hide from the seeking allies, enemies, and the duties of a Primarch. Throughout the millennia, neither the Chaos cultists, nor the Imperial Inquisition, nor the Sons of the Phoenix could establish even an approximate location of this world. However, according to some rumors, during the period of the 13th Black Crusade, Abaddon the Despoiler managed to locate Fulgrim, and even convinced him to participate in an attack on the Cadian sector. There's also a legend about the retribution of the ancient Rylanor, a venerable dreadnought. who survived the betrayal at Istvan III. The hero of the heresy era spent millennia under the wreckage of a burned world and managed to create a beacon luring Fulgrim to the planet. After expressing everything he had accumulated over the years of solitude, Relinor detonated a viral bomb, thereby destroying the mortal shell of the demon prince. Of course, this action did not lead to the death of Fulgrim, but being reborn in a new body, the Primarch felt broken as Relinor rejected his magnificence and called him even more grotesque than the demon prince Tzeentch. It is known that Fabius Bile, who repeatedly engaged in the cloning of Primarchs, created an exceptionally successful copy of Fulgrim. The new Phoenix felt guilty for the actions of the original, remained loyal to the Emperor, and even fought on the side of the Loyalist forces. However, this persona is not directly related to the real Fulgrim and is unlikely to play a significant role in the most recent history of the Imperium, as Fabius Bile gave the Primarch clone to the treasury of Trazyn the Infinite. The real Phoenician continues to spend centuries in the warp, glorifying his deeds to Slaanesh. In his domains, millions of mortal slaves die, whose screams delight the god of pleasure, and their souls become materials for creating the strongest stimulants. There is hardly anything left in the demon Prince Fulgrim from the former perfect Primarch. Most likely he no longer remembers the material world, the Imperium, and his brothers, or tries to pretend as if he does not remember. After all, it is known that time after time, he asked Fabius Bile to create clones of Ferrus Manus, in conversations with whom he unsuccessfully tried to find redemption.